Welcome to Deep in the D-Pad, where we explore all things gaming through an intellectual lens. Today's episode is about something you've undoubtedly thought about before: death. We're going to discuss why the word lives is so common across games, as well as different death mechanics that we can see in different games, and maybe track the history a little bit there. But before we get into that, Carlos, do you have a D-Pad delight to share with us?
All right, so in the interest of having a death-related story, I will talk about No Man's Sky. It's a game I have played a whole hell of a lot of. I played it a bunch out of VR, and then once they put in that VR update, I slapped on my headset and explored the stars in beautiful virtual reality. But my story has to do with like a less beautiful moment. I had been playing No Man's Sky on a permadeath run. This is probably in the first year that it came out, so it wasn't like too much to do in that game. So I was like, man, I just kind of like this whole Ray Bradbury, like walking around, finding weird monuments and like exploring planets. So let me do that with like permadeath, so I feel like even more tense when I'm out like farming all these red crystals, because that's all I could do. So long story short, I get 8 hours into a permadeath run, because if you die, it like deletes your save file. Like that's it. It's permadeath. And I was like just exploring a planet. I don't exactly remember what I was chasing after, but I was doing this trick that makes you super jump. Basically, like if you melee and then activate your jump at the same time or at some certain timing, you'll like fwoomph like yourself like extremely far forward. And so I was doing this just to kind of like explore the land easily. And I crested this hill that I didn't realize was like just a full drop cliff, and that was right when my jetpack was reaching like 5% fuel levels. So I took a very long fall, and even though I tried to cushion it with like activating the jetpack, you know, right before I hit the ground, like my legs broke, my character died, and it was just like 8 hours of progress just because of a fucking hill. A cliff disguised as a hill.
The fact that it deletes your save file altogether is so hard to process. That just seems like almost like conniving on the part of the developers. It's like, this is such a permadeath run that you can't even access, you know, an earlier save file. Like that just feels really brutal.
Yeah, definitely. I do not have, at least at that time, I did not have a ton of experience with the permadeath mechanic and also the erasing of your file. But as a player, even though that was frustrating, I really liked it. I think I do still kind of like it to a degree, that there's like this added weight to it, right? There's that meta layer of like my save file will just be fully gone. Like I can't even go into the Windows files and like hunt it down, right? That just makes playing it a lot more fun because it makes it intense for me.
The stakes are so high.
Yeah. I'm like, oh, if I don't breathe, like the last 30 hours will be for naught.
Yeah, exactly. There's another tricky thing that happened to me in that game. This isn't quite my delight, although I definitely do want to talk about something related to No Man's Sky and death. But in that game, there are moons, or, you know, things that may appear to be planets but don't have the gravitational force of a planet. So
right, yeah.
You'll jump, and if you don't like jetpack during your descent, you'll like slam and hit the ground because you pick up so much velocity, I guess. I'm not exactly sure how it's working physics wise, right? But I remember being like startled at my own death at one point in that game, based on like gravity being different on this very particular moon that I was on. And I think you were actually there with me, and that's what I want to talk about. You and I had this. I know that you'll be able to recall this better than me, because you just have like laser memory focus for video games. You have abundance of detail to call upon. But remember when we tried getting to the center of the universe in No Man's Sky? I'm not exactly sure how to describe the strategy that Carlos and I had, but we spawned together in the game, and we're kind of doing this like co-op run where we're just trying to like bounce from like galaxy to galaxy.
Right, we're trying to play regular No Man's Sky together. So this is like before they put in those group quests. I forget what they call them off the top of my head. Expeditions, maybe. But the expeditions were put in there explicitly to spawn you all in the same place and have you go through a journey together. We were like, nah, we just want to play No Man's Sky. Like, let's just join a party, hopefully spawn on the same planet, and then make it to the center of the universe.
Yeah, so we would be like spawned in the same, like, let's say galaxy, right? So we could fly to each other and find each other. If you haven't played this game, it is like unbelievably vast, right? Like, I remember hearing a statistic that it was like, you know, like something like under 10% of the procedurally generated planets will ever be inhabited by actual players. So there's just a ton of empty space out there and unexplored terrain. So Carlos and I started the game together, spawned in about the same area. We would meet up, right? And as long as one of us stayed alive, our progress, you know, we were continuing to progress closer to the center of the galaxy. So if I died, I would have to respawn while Carlos was still alive and, you know, get to him as quickly as possible. But if we were both dead, then I think we would have just spawned somewhere like in some random galaxy or something. But at one point we got like off track where like our ability to like hyperspeed through the galaxies was like there was a divide between us and we were like kind of coasting along parallel tracks together, but we couldn't figure out how to like link up, right? Is that basically
that's pretty much exactly it, right? Because like we were still in the same galaxy, I think, more or less. Actually, I don't know what the fucking scales to this thing is.
I don't know either, dude. It's so big.
So what had happened is that Ryan died, and it spawned him. I think it like just, you know, you die or you crash your ship, whatever, and like some of your stuff gets broken. Maybe you lose like an upgrade or something, and that's what happened. Like we had our equal upgrade branches that we were building for like a couple hours, and then that got like detoured, and now suddenly like our maps were kind of different too. Like we had the same maps, but this is how travel works, I guess, in this game, maybe in real space stuff in general. But like you have these various like mini solar systems that are like X light years apart, and they might be certain colors. So you'll need not only a warp drive that can get you the amount of light years you need to go, but you need one that is like the color clearance card for whatever fucking solar system you're trying to go to. So we ended up just being side by side, looking at our big galaxy maps, which have a billion freaking colored dots on it to represent groups
stars,
of planets.
like suns, basically.
Exactly, yeah. So you'd zoom into the sun and realize, oh, there's like 9 planets around this sun, or there's 3 planets, or what have you. And so Ryan and I are jumping from like star to star to star, just being almost like side by side pole position, like race cars.
Hoping that our paths will intersect again at one point so we can actually play together and not just be on 2 different tracks that are running approximately the same direction.
100%. Like we want to be on the same planet and we can't even be in the same freaking solar system. Like that's how big of a problem we're having here. And it was almost like a bunch of like people in the 90s, or like, I'll say 90s, yeah, because that's when it kind of got big and phased out, but like MapQuest or pulling out actual tangible maps. Like that's what we were doing, but for fucking space, where like the roads aren't flat 2D. Like I have to explode my map into like a cube just so that I can understand where Ryan is in comparison to me, and we can kind of see where our lines are connecting, blah, 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 what have you. And I think we ended up finding this one nexus point that it was like, wait, your line is leading to this? Yeah, my line is leading to this. And if I recall correctly, one of us died along the way, and that just completely fucked the entire plan.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to tell.
Once there was a second death, we could not get back on track.
Yeah. I mean, you know, I feel sobered by the time that I've lived between the moment that we played that and now, but we were insane. Like, we were, like, fanatical maniacs trying to get to the center. We were like, come on, man! You know, like, just, like, these... Like,
if you just get 2 of these fuel cores and a cadmium drive, go north. What do you mean north? We're in space! It's like, fuck.
It was very exciting for us, and yeah, I mean, I can't remember the precise final death that we had, but there was like a hangover of coming out of that game, whereas like when Dumbo has that dream, he like wakes up from his like hallucinogenic...
The pink elephants,
yeah. The pink elephants.
Yeah, definitely. Like, oh man, I feel you there. Whenever you exit like a very, I guess focused might be the word, I'm not entirely sure, a very high stakes, I guess, like No Man's Sky session, it certainly feels like you just are in some sort of stupor, like your mind is foggy, your fucking vision's still seeing the stars.
It's because we created the objective. Like, we were not it wasn't like we were just following an ordinary game mission, right? Like, we get so hyped and like wrapped up in like we're going on an adventure together and we're gonna accomplish all of our goals, and like
there was a Lewis and Clark aspect to it.
There was a Lewis and Clark. We're on our couches, but yeah, that's like
we needed
like
to
them.
Plot that course through the unexplored universe. And, when we took a little detour, we needed our Sacagawea, but she was not there. And we died because of it.
So I think that one of the like most effective ways that we can really have this episode is by first detailing the different kinds of death mechanics that we see throughout games. And then we can like kind of dig deeper into like the philosophical meat of, death as it relates to video games or appears in video games. To that end, Carlos, what is the first kind of like death that you can think of in video games?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if there was death at first, and I'm kind of just using Tennis for Two as like game one example. Tennis for Two was like that original version of Pong that was made on a big supercomputer before we had like actual arcade cabinets and home consoles, what have you. But there was no death in that. I think the most common form of, say, death or dying in a game, I'm not saying how it's portrayed, but pretty much just as a mechanic. Like, death is very much a, like, end of your current attempt at whatever you're doing in the game, and often being reset to... In modern day, we're being reset to checkpoints. Let's say earlier, like original Mario, you would get reset to the beginning of a level or something, right? And if you were to run out, if you were to die too many times, then your grand adventure would come to an end. There's a weird meta aspect to it that, like, you as a player are acknowledging, I am on a quest to stop Bowser and save the Princess Peach. Oh no, Mario, my main character, has fallen into a pit in the very first level and died. In a real life scenario, that should just be it. Like, the princess would be done for. But we are acknowledging that, the play is being reset. I get another chance to cross that pit, and I could, like, save the princess. But if I fall into that pit too many times, then the play is over. Like, I am actually considered dead without any, like, real narrative reasoning. And back then it's because, we kind of didn't need it. Like, people were just playing the game to play the game, experience the mechanics or whatever. But because death is such a constant within human life, the human experience, like death, what's that joke? Like, the things you can always count on are death and taxes and something else.
Yeah, no, it's just those two.
Okay. Death and taxes. Those two things being so present in the human experience, I think just made it fairly easy to understand, this character is out of commission and now is coming back.
I want to highlight something that I don't know really how to describe this, right? But let's take Pac-Man, right? Let's say you boot up Pac-Man, you have 3 lives, right? You would say that you died if let's say Blinky taps you, right? And you're like, oh no, Pac-Man's dead. But you have 2 lives, right? What would we call it when you run out of lives? Like, you lost the game? Would you say that was like a permadeath run, essentially, where you got 3 lives and then, because there's kind of like a death of the entire game, and then there's like the death of a round. And I don't know that we like distinguish that commonly, but do you have thoughts on that?
With older gaming, because I think, it's kind of less ubiquitous in modern day gaming, but in more like N64 to like GameCube era and even before that, I think it would often be acknowledged as game over.
Game over, yeah, totally,
right?
Totally. Yeah.
So like you would have the, like, I don't even know if the game would tell you died. Like, let's again just circle back to Mario 1. You'd fall into the pit. music would play letting you know that something bad has happened, and then it would just black screen back to the beginning of the level, right? But there's never a point where it's just like Mario died and then has to like go to the beginning. It usually will do that when you run out of those retries.
Right, so there's like, when you die in a game, it's like a reset, right? So it could be to the start, it could be to a checkpoint. But either way, like, those enemies will usually respawn, where they were, even if you just tapped some of them out, they'll still be there, right? But with the game over, old school game overs are so frustrating. Like, when they boot you back to the menu and you have to like reload in. I mean, it just feels so unnecessary, and like, it's a carryover from the arcade world, right? Where it made sense that it was like asking you to put in your money again. But like, by like PS2, we did not need game overs. Like, it's just like a punishment. Like,
there were also like more levels to it, I guess. Not actual like content levels, but like in the game over, it could be a game over and then you get the retry from whatever the latest chapter that you completed was, or it was a just full send game over, save data deleted, like there wasn't even save data, maybe, what have you. But like, yeah, that's it. Like the trail is over. You're going to have to start the grand journey from the beginning. Like, I guess Ghosts and Goblins is like a really good call out for that, because that game's like notoriously difficult, but it's also got like a bunch of these levels linked to it as you're getting to Dracula's castle, right? So you'll get halfway through, all of a sudden, game over, and now you're back at like the very first level, which like, nowadays there's kind of like this idea of like, you must appreciate my as a player, my time, and to have that harsh of a save system or that harsh of a punishment for getting that game over, like, I think it's just way less marketable nowadays than it was in the past. Like you mentioned, it's an arcade holdover.
Yeah, I think Star Fox 64 did something like that, where like you had to complete all the levels in one run, basically. And now we have roguelikes, which are a more common version of this, but many of them have like changes. There's an overall progression system, right? So you might get new weapons or new abilities, or things are worth more or cost less, which makes you feel a sense of satisfaction as you're playing the game. You're not just kind of like repeating the exact same actions with the exact same abilities and skills,
And the progression you're referring to is the fact that the game is more or less saving. Like, even if you die, you're always going to respawn and what have you.
New dialogue options, perhaps, but you're advancing the story, even though, yeah, exactly. Okay, and we touched on permadeath. You mentioned it in your Deep Head Delight, but are there games that do it differently than No Man's Sky that you want to call out in terms of, like, deleting your file seems quite extreme to me, but anything else come to mind?
Several games I think of when I think of permadeath. I think of Spelunky. That game is almost it's almost chilling how unceremoniously you die in that game, and just how easily you can die in that game. But yeah, you lose your entire progress in the run. I don't think there's really any progression between runs. So that's just straight permadeath. It's not like deleting your user profile. It's still tracking, various metrics as you play the game. I also think of games like Super Mother Lode and FTL. These are two different games where you play as a crew of like people working on some sort of machinery. Super Mother Lode, you're driving these like small square pickup trucks that also have drills on them, and you're trying to get minerals deeper into the ground and stuff. But if you run out of fuel, which everything takes fuel to do, if you run out of fuel, your vehicle explodes and you'll lose that character. In FTL, you are commanding, you're not any individual character, but you're this like God's eye point of view character commanding a ship crew on a spaceship, right? Almost like Starship Enterprise, right? But you only got like 5 people. And in both these games, if your machinery were to crack, get damaged, right, things would happen that would result in you losing one of these people. And you can, for some of these games, like I think FTL, you can like have a random chance to acquire extra characters to your crew over the course of your run, but more likely than not, like you're gonna have your amount of your crew and you want to treat them very preciously, because if you lose the entire crew, then the ship has no one to pilot it and thus game over. Similar to Super Mother Lode, if you lose your whole cast of characters, that's it. Like, the game is over. You lose all the progress. You would have to start a new permadeath run.
Right. So the characters are expendable up to a point, right? So
yeah. So rather than having overall lives, rather than it being Mario and all the focus being on Mario falling down the pit, now it's more so like, okay, I have one life, and that is the life of my crew. And the crew is now broken into like 5 pie slices. Again, to go to Mario again, like Mario 64 had the like pie slices that would go from blue to yellow to red as they got ticked off. And if you thought of that as your ship crew and the starship is your pie, as you're losing each member, you're losing a pie slice off of that chart of your health. And once all the members are gone, and like Mario dies, he gets all woozy and falls over. Same thing with Super Mother Lode, and between those two games, Super Mother Lode, I think, does a full permadeath. Like, you don't keep things between runs. I think maybe you unlock characters, but that doesn't matter. That's mostly a cosmetic thing, if I recall correctly. On the FTL side, if you like lose all your characters, FTL is more of a roguelike. So if you lose all your characters, you're just going to lose the run, and you could go back to the main menu and start anew with like a new set of characters that's about the same stats, maybe different names, blah, blah, blah. Either way, it still keeps game over, right? We still keep game over. We're always going to have game over. It's just that these games interpret the lives, quote unquote, system in different ways.
Yeah, I like that you bring up the Super Mario 64 like declining health, and I was wondering what other mechanics are used in games to create death, right? So I already mentioned like the Pac-Man, if you're touched by a ghost, you're killed. You mentioned, a health bar that, gradually decreases as the more times that you run into contact with enemies. And, obviously some of those games have health like hidden around the world that you can then, acquire. There's also something like Super Smash Brothers, right? Where you don't really have a health bar, you have like damage, but you really just have to get thrown off a ledge, which is kind of like getting pushed out of the sumo ring is essentially what that is.
So that type of death is a little bit tricky because Smash Brothers has different rule sets and stuff, right? So like if we had stocks, then we don't actually we die several times, but we don't hit game over. Like, again, everything will just circle back to game over. It's just a matter of like, how do we get to that point? So if it's a matter of stocks, then like, yeah, the player in Smash Brothers specifically must receive X amount of damage, which then will like exponentially affect an impulse that happens when they are attacked, which leads to the launching off of stage. I guess they call that damage percentage. Like, rather than a decaying health bar, it's just more of this like,
it's secondary, though, to the death, right?
Yeah.
Because the difference is that rather than the collision detector being on an enemy, the collision detector is at the borders of the screen. So if you're considered dead if you fall off of the stage. So you could have 0 damage and just jump off the edge all day until you run out of lives, and no one has to hit you, but it's considered dead. So the damage is almost it's something that can affect your, I guess, gravity. I'm not exactly sure which aspects it's affecting. If someone hits you with an equal amount of force, you will fly farther to the other end of the screen. So it's more likely to result in your death. But you don't necessarily need any death, right? If you're bad at the game and someone grapples you and throws you across, if you don't know how to jump and float to the correct side of the stage, you'll die.
Right. Yeah. So I guess that's kind of then just, an extension of the Mario / Sonic 2D death is like, hey, you fell off screen, therefore you are dead.
Anything else? Is there any other kinds of death that we haven't touched on?
One type of game that I noticed like doesn't really use death all that often. Maybe it does, but I just don't see it a bunch. Is like puzzle games. Like, I know when I was playing Candy Crush a bunch, like so many years ago, that and other mobile games would have hearts, right? And these hearts, if you lost a level, a heart would break, and you have 2 hearts left. If you don't have any hearts, then you can't play levels, and every 24 hours you get a heart back, right? And they would refer to these as lives.
Yeah, it's like a ticket to entry, basically.
Yeah, but like, you personally, like, you are not playing a character who lives or dies in this universe. Like, with many of these puzzle games, you're just some there's not really this big entity, you know what I mean? You are just some nameless, faceless, storyless entity that is performing whatever task is in front of you to complete the puzzle. So really, it's for whatever these arcade puzzle games are, it's really just a failed attempt, whether that be like to crush this many candies or what have you. Like, that is your failure state, and you still get a game over, but the game over is, you know, much more lenient. We're kind of focusing on mobile games since that's the example, but like the game over state is, hey, you can't play this puzzle anymore until you wait an amount of time, or until you have more hearts, actually, I should say, because there's multiple ways to get more hearts.
Right, and this is like carrying over the arcade version of Game Over too, right? Because they're essentially trying to get you to pay, right? Like that ideally, their ideal customer is someone who is not going to be hindered by the fact that they're out of lives, and they're just going to kind of use that as a cue to put more money in the machine so that they can play as soon as possible, as many times as possible. Yeah,
it's very much just a ticket to entry, put in another quarter, like whatever you want to call it. Again, it's not even death, so I don't know if this would fit well within what we're talking about, but it's just the sense of game over, you can't play anymore, being done outside of death as a mechanic or as a visual on the screen.
Yeah, I feel very weird about the fact that we would refer to those kinds of like, that kind of like mobile game scenario as like deaths or lives. You know, perhaps we would describe it, we'd be more likely to describe it as lives, rather than like thinking like when you run out of lives, like I am dead, or like the game is dead. You know, we don't really frame it that way for those kinds of mobile games or those puzzle games that have those ticket to entry mechanics.
It also seems weird to say like, oh no, I'm out of lives, like I can't play this puzzle level. And it's like, what does lives have to do with it?
Yeah, and I'm hesitant to talk about it from like a linguistic perspective, or like analyze the nomenclature, right? Like, why is it that we use this word, right? And that's definitely something that we are going to need to get into, and like perhaps we're going to be more concerned than we should be, but I guess we won't know until we have that conversation. Before we jump into that, I'm curious if you have anything to say about, or maybe I should just like, maybe I just want to mention that a lot of games have a mechanic where you know, you're killed by another player and you respawn after a delay, right? And so it's not a set number of lives that you have, right? So I'm thinking of, you know, first-person shooters, Call of Duty, Halo, etc., where your kill-death ratio is something that people would talk about, right? If people in these circles who are very serious about these games would think about that ratio. Nobody talks about a kill-death ratio when you're talking about like Mario and Goombas, you know? It's just, you know, how, like, that could be score might be the focus there, and, you know, probably not even so much anymore. You know, there are speedrunners, there are different ways that people take pride in beating games, but there is this whole world that we haven't even mentioned yet, right? Of like that first person shooter, you know, wait 10 seconds and you respawn, and then your goal is to kill as many people as possible before you die. Do you have any response to that, or is that just like, we can leave that there?
No. Yeah, I think we should just leave it there.
Well, let's drop that and move on to the nomenclature. Okay, so returning to the puzzle games, right? Like, I think that that's a really good example, because puzzle games are peaceful, right? They're not action-adventure games that require death and killing, and, you know, the overcoming is more of like a cognitive experience rather than something that is testing your response time. You know, your response time doesn't matter as much. Gosh, I keep thinking of counterexamples. I'm like, Tetris, obviously, if you're playing Tetris and, you know, you're on like level 15, your response time matters a lot, right? But it's not the same as a first-person shooter or a fighting game or, you know, some kind of action game.
Yeah, I get what you're saying, and I think we don't ubiquitously call it death.
Yeah, you'd
I
say
think
you
we're
lose.
Maybe stretching a little more, but like, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, if you played Tetris and you didn't win, you wouldn't be like, I'm dead, or, you know, my Tetraminos are dying. You'd be like, dang, I busted. Like, I lost.
Yeah, exactly. So with like that being said, I think, you know, it's probably more so that we just see death and or lives for the most part. Lives a little less so, because I guess we mentioned Candy Crush, and I'm sure other, you know, Pac-Man uses the idea of lives. I think the terminology of death and or the mechanic of death usually centers around combat scenarios or some sort of conflict.
Conflict, yes, that's the perfect word. There's an external conflict that a player is usually interacting with in like an action adventure, first person shooter, etc. Those kinds of games that we've talked about, where the character is dying. But puzzle games, they don't. The conflict is like a mental thing for the user, not for any particular character typically. And so there is nothing that can die, right? Does that make sense?
Usually, yeah. Unless we hearken to another episode, the escape rooms and whatnot. There are sometimes puzzle games that are centered within I don't know how closely we want to call them puzzle games, but for the sake of playing devil's advocate, I'll just say there might be like death game, puzzle room, puzzle game type scenarios that do exist. And in those cases, it makes more sense for death to be a mechanic. Actually, the Saw movie video games are the perfect example of this. Like tons of puzzles in those games, although probably maybe action adventure puzzle game is like what they would call it. But anyway, you die lots of different ways in that game, and it's got plenty of puzzles. So that's where it would make sense. And there's a conflict, right? But puzzle games like Candy Crush or Drop 7 or what was it? 2048?
Tetris?
The one where you like slide numbers into each other and multiply them?
Yeah,
okay, 2048, yeah. All those things, like they don't have a conflict. Like you said, they're just presenting this logical spatial problem for you to solve. And I just wanted to put that out there. Like, yes, we can have violent puzzle games or puzzle games with conflict that do break this rule. But for the most part, we're talking about non-death based puzzle games. Yeah,
those puzzle games that you're referring to that are kind of like the select few, they're usually supplemented by story or like some kind of adventure scenario, right? But there are a lot of puzzle games that there's no pretense of a story that's surrounding this. It's like just kind of like you put your pencil on the maze and you solve the maze, and like the fun is completing the maze, or 2048 trying to get a block that says 2048 is the whole game and is the fun that you're supposed to be having while you're playing that game. One thing that I would like to bring up, and I hope that this is an okay place, but we're talking about these like death in puzzle games, right? And I was thinking of Edith Finch. I guess I should give the backbone of what this game is, right? I don't want to do any spoilers, right? So I'll be very careful here. Essentially, a woman is going to the house that she grew up in and looking in the different rooms, and basically her family's lived here for a few generations, and everybody's room is kind of still intact. And the idea behind the game is that there's a curse that people die young in her family, and then she's kind of like experiencing what it was like for these individuals, right? It's a narrative game. You walk through it kind of at your own pace. There's a lot of there's a lot of like detail in the setting that is kind of used to describe and bolster the descriptions of the people in Edith's family. But the game, doesn't have any actual death in it, right? Like in terms of from the player's point of view, there's a lot of death in the story, and it's interesting to me that there's something philosophical about this, or at least artistic, right? It's a magical realist story. I consider it like one of the most literary games I've ever played. I found it to be very thought-provoking, and a lot of that is about like death and grief and, kind of the human condition. And of course there's a spin on it because there's a curse, and we have to like take that for granted in order to like really immerse ourselves in the story and appreciate that. But Edith herself, we don't see her dying. We're not put in positions where there are quick time events where Edith will die if we don't stop some, event from happening. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, or I just felt like I feel like it's appropriate to address, and it's interesting that like we can compare puzzle games that are kind of like forcing death to come in, and I think the developers of Edith Finch made a very conscious decision to not allow Edith to be in harm's way.
Yeah, I personally liked playing through Edith Finch because it centered so much around death without me actually dying or risking dying in any of these scenarios. And I think there are very few games that center in so much on kind of just the existence and the reality of death. It's like way more death is just like this means to reset you. Like from a design point of view, death is just a technical fail condition to me. It's like, how am I going to handle the player, losing a fight? Or how am I going to handle the player going into an area that they don't belong? Oh, well, I just need to reset them to this location so that they can, play the way they're supposed to play, quote unquote, the way I'm intending them to play. And with that being said, it kind of like nullifies a lot of like the death stuff to me until I like, I don't know, think about it more like we're doing now. Like playing Edith Finch certainly got me to think about it more, actually care about like the deaths or the fact that the death is like ever present. Whereas like in Mega Man, if I jump onto a spike pit, he immediately blows up in 8 different directions with like bubbles and stuff, but I'm just like, oh shucks, guess I better, jump over that pit. Whereas Edith Finch is like, oh man, like I need to sit down. Death is coming for me at any moment. I need to rethink my priorities, start recording some more podcasts, set some life goals and shit.
That brings me to the question that we've kind of been circling around, right? Like, why call it death in the first place? And it makes sense in some games that are, let's say combat-based, right? To, just use a big category. Death perhaps is a necessary aspect of those games, right? If you're playing a war-based game, people die in war. And if you're trying to simulate that to some degree, then a character will probably die. If you're playing a zombie game, right? Like there has to be some kind of threat in order for the stakes to be extant, right? But, it bugs me a little bit, when we talk about games that don't really actually involve a player character who dies, but they're still referred to as lives. There's something about it that seems like, we're not giving death like its due respect almost. And I know that it's a concept and it isn't actually, something that has dignity, but, as death is something that we experience as part of life and that, we'll experience other like people around us who will die. I want there to be some kind of like, not reverence necessarily, but acknowledgement perhaps that like death is a very serious topic. And, it's not like never joke about death or anything like that. Like I wouldn't advocate for that by any means, but to give it something, to assign that word to something that can so easily be brought back to life just doesn't feel appropriate. I think it's almost why like Pokemon faint instead of dying, so that they can be resurrected. Like the game itself can be resurrected. Like you're not actually dying unless it's a permadeath run. But maybe I'm just being a baby about this, and it's like actually not that serious. But it's like it is something I think about and I'm concerned about.
I think in the case of Pokemon, they did very specifically choose the word faint instead of die, and that's largely because it's like a younger oriented IP and what have you. But like, Pokemon Red and Blue, like the Pokemon would faint. So my guess is wild historical speculation is like probably at some early iteration of the battle system of that game, it did say like X unit died or X Pokemon died, whatever, and it would get revived. But I think that is just mostly verbiage, like specifically verbiage for the sake of Pokemon. Like, you can see the Pokemon, you can see its health is at 0 when it's in your party, right? And you can't throw them out to fight. Like, basically, you can't do anything with this Pokemon until you put it back on that operating table behind Nurse Joy, and then it, comes to life. So it is more or less dead. It's just being hand-waved. It's like fainted, swirlies on the eyes, that type of thing.
Yeah, but you're looking at Pokemon's like fainting and being like, they're effectively dead. But I'm looking at Candy Crush Lives and being like, you effectively have no tickets. Like, why are we calling these lives? Like, that's dramatic as hell. Like, can we back that up and like re-examine the kind of language that we want to use around video games? And, I'm not going to jump to the conclusion that, children playing these games are going to have a deranged understanding of life and death because the word is being thrown around. But we also don't understand the psychological consequences if there are any. And it just seems like dramatic and unnecessary. And can't we use more accurate language? Can't we use language that it doesn't bear the emotional weight of death or, the spiritual significance of it, and God, I just feel like such an old man right now. I'm just like, I'm like nagging in my own ear, like, shut up, dude. Like, you gotta like get off your high horse or whatever. But like, I do feel like this matters on some level, even if it isn't the most important thing, It
might matter on some level. Like, I mean, I don't know how people learn about death. I thought it was through goldfish and stuff. It's certainly not going to be through fucking Mario. Like, I don't think some kid is going to play Spiritfarer and realize the gravity that is death and like what people deal with leading up to it and potentially even beyond it.
Oh, I completely disagree. I think the point of Spiritfarer is for like children to have complex ideas about death.
I will agree that like Spiritfarer will open up a player's mind to like various questions and thinkings around death, but I find it very difficult for like a kid to maybe really figure that out. And I might be completely like wrong, because I do remember, you know, when characters pass to the other side, like that's it. Like they're not on your boat anymore. Their house is empty. There is like this odd like sense of
grieving.
Yeah, like I was going to say closure, but it's not even closure because their shit is still there, right? So it's kind of fucking with you like on that extra level. But anyway, taking a zoom out of this theoretical where like a 6-year-old is playing Spiritfarer, I think death is just kind of like easier for everyone to understand at a glance, right? Like if we as game designers were to say like, oh, don't fall in the pit or you'll be penalized and respawn, or like don't touch the spike pit or you'll be disbanded and have to respawn. Like we need one very common, easy to understand word because everybody in different video games, you know, they kind of die in different ways, but we can all just call it dying. Like Mega Man just gets like blooped from existence. Mario, he'll like fall and Mamma Mia. In Last of Us, like you'll get a knife to the face and then like grossly jerk around for 30 seconds as you're losing like consciousness from reality. And like these are all death. They're all very like different styles of death, right? But they're there and they're easy for us to understand. Whereas having to abstract it to represent what it is more functionally would just create confusion across the users.
I think that's a really strong argument. And you know, like there's something intuitive about like, yeah, we just needed a big category and, you know, we could kind of just lump everything in and, you know, but it's less calculated than that because all of these like game studios are emerging at like different times. So, you know, I think it's kind of just like passing on traditions and like, you know, if they didn't need to iterate on the word death, right, but they could iterate on other things, the more consistency they can keep between games, the more a new player will be able to be like confident in playing, right? If I know that this game has death and this game and a separate game refers to it the same mechanic as dying or death or losing a life, that familiarity is like the buy-in for the game or the you know, there are fewer obstacles in place. I can more easily connect with this game. One like just quick asterisk that I want to put out there is that like I understand that you need to be like developmentally appropriate. Like, you know, like one's age is a significant factor in how they process a game, right? So for Spiritfarer, Edith Finch, whatever, you know, although I think youth can be profoundly affected by that, I don't think a 6-year-old is there like, dude, this purgatory stuff is lit, you know, like. But I also like the different depictions of death that you mentioned, you know, like Mario is kind of like a sanitized death. I don't know how you would describe like Last of Us style death, but like clearly it's not.
Last
like
of Us
goofy.
is like the horror of death. So like Mario or, you know, cartoony games where you sort of just poof into a cloud, like that's very much sanitized death, like you said. I don't know if we'd call it realism, hyper realism, or horrific realism, but like Last of Us 2, I think they made a very specific effort to make their death animations as painful, quote unquote, as possible, whether that means painful for the person who has a knife through them or painful to the individual who has enacted that knife upon them and now has to think about the horror that they just inflicted on this this thing.
So it's like
that's
psychologically
still going.
provocative.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So that's why I say I don't know if I would call that like death realism, hyper realism. Like when I think death realism, I kind of think of Spelunky, honestly, because as I mentioned earlier, like it's eerily unsanctimonious about how you die. And that's what I notice about like a lot of action movies, at least, that really hit for me, is like they don't glorify the death.
It just happens,
and they don't
upon
horrify
a
the
character.
death.
Yeah, for sure.
It very like almost No Country for Old Men, right? Like it's just like this is just gonna happen, and there's nothing that we can do to like stop it or steer it, and that feels scary. Like whereas you don't get that kind of like this was inevitable type fear from seeing like this hyper realistic, you know, spent 400 hours animating this woman in pain because you stabbed her. Like that, at least for me, kind of hits less than being like, la-di-da-di-da, I'm Spelunky, and then seeing him like get impaled on the spikes and the whole music just stops. There's no fucking nice sound effects. I am just silently seeing my Indiana Jones like get further and further impaled on spikes. And then so that's kind of like, I guess, I don't know.
Mundane death almost.
Yeah, I guess we could call it that. So the sanitized death is your Mario. The mundane or callous death, emotionless death, like that's Spelunky. You have your horrified death, which is like Last of Us. And then you have your like almost pornified death, which is Doom, the glory kill systems, where you're very explicitly like, oh, this guy's wobbling around, let me right click on him so I punch him in the gut, slice his head off, and then punt his head into another guy. Woo, I'm killing, isn't this sick? Like that's taking it to the extreme glorification, like cartoonish level.
Yeah, or like the Dead Rising, like, you know, disemboweling was like, as children, we would think it was hilarious to rip out someone's intestines for some reason. And, you know, it would just be like, walk up to anybody you can and disembowel them, you know?
Yeah.
But there's something about, I mean, that is just like,
well, those
that
were
is gore
zombies,
porn.
though. We knew we weren't doing it to regular ass living people.
That's true.
Like
of course.
Last of Us, you're fighting other human AIs. We were disemboweling the undead.
Why gore? Like, what is it trying to do? Like, what is it like is there something about it that feels awesome? Like, we know that this is not something that could actually be done in real life, and there's a spectacle to it, almost like looking at a sunset and being overwhelmed by awe, but in like a negative direction, where it's like, you know, grotesqueness, you know? I mean, it's not trying to give you a sensation of what could actually be, right?
Yeah, I don't know. I think there's like a spectrum to that, given like the 4 types of games we discussed and how they depict death. I definitely think, you know, the gore, the combat, at least within our own society, being the like American society, I think that's just where we are allowed to push the envelope. Like, you'll see far more games with far more gore compared to, let's say, like any sex game, right? Like Honey Pop or any of these freaking games you see Steam recommending to you, right, that have like visual novel nudity tags. Like, those things get absolutely no marketing. Like, we in American society cannot like show nudity. Like, heaven forbid a nipple is on the screen. Like, that's what got Dante's Inferno in like a little bit of heat at some point. But Dante's Inferno had like a whole succubus boss that had like fucking, like, it had boobs with like mouth on the nipples, and like babies were coming out of the nipple mouths, and it was like completely fucked, but like, you know, chopping imps in half with your scythe and like decapitating undead enemies, maybe even living enemies that are like just the souls of the damned. Like, that, totally fine. Set of boobies, get that the fuck out of here. We woo, like, we gotta bonk you on the head for that one. And I think that's just where we are, like, in gaming, and it's been exacerbated because like I don't know if exacerbated is the right word, but it's been allowed to like flourish because we have so much less restraint on the violent aspect of it than we do on the more like sexual puritanical side. And this is even with, you know, all the decades of like, the games are hurting our children, all this hyper violence in the games, blah blah blah. Meanwhile, like, bro, fucking Texas Chainsaw Massacre's coming out, John Wick's coming out, like Dirty Harry is out. Like you know, we glorify violence in like every media we can, and at least when it comes to mass media, right? Like who's going to get clicks, what's going to get clicks. Conflict just has a way higher ROI than anything else.
Yeah, I didn't know that Dante's Inferno example. That'll stay with me. It's. I really like your juxtaposition, right? Like, how is it the case that we can be sexually prudish, in this depiction of body horror, right? Like, it's not like this succubus was intended to provoke sexual arousal. Even it's disgusting, it's grotesque, right? But that is not allowed. That's deemed inappropriate. But decapitations are standard, basically, right? Like those are just the currency of video games, right? We're comfortable seeing those. That's part of what people want, in the video game. Porn is a huge industry though, right? So perhaps it's just like something about secrecy. Like, whoever the people are who create these ratings or, it's very arbitrary, and it's like trying to give a time slice of what is appropriate in the culture. And there's just a stark difference, even though the idea that there's a criteria where it's like, if there is a nipple at all that appears in this game, it is banned, or it must be rated, that's so arbitrary and such a unartistic way of looking at video games, right? And I understand that there's like a duty to try to like, direct age appropriate content to youth or whatever, but it just feels like an unwieldy machine that doesn't really make a lot of sense once it's under scrutiny. Yeah,
I agree. And, it could be this rating stuff, and, maybe we'll do a bigger exploration of the ESRB, but that group could very much just be an ever-rotating group of random-ass people, right? And the sensibilities between person to person change, like, so greatly. So this is actually something that came up with, like, the film ratings board, is that, like, you could potentially get a different rating based on what week you're sending in your movie, right? You could have a bunch of, like, very conservative and or puritanical like type viewers watching Beetlejuice, and then next week now Beetlejuice is being reviewed by a bunch of like alt rock, punk rock, goths and whoever else like would be totally up their boat, and they would give it like very different reviews. So like you said, it very much like could change with the times, like what the review is going to be, but it also changes with like who's actually looking at those reviews.
Yes. I have so many thoughts, but let's table this.
Yeah. We'll follow this up in another episode.
Right. I guess, since we are talking about like death, and I'm trying to, in the least hokey way possible, bring up the spiritual significance of death and accepting one's inevitable death and the death of their loved ones, right? Do you think it is the case that people, through the course of normal like death and life cycles in video games, right? Like, I'm not talking about the Spirit for the Edith Finch that are kind of like tackling death conceptually and narratively, right? I'm talking more about just the mechanic of death. Do you think that either grants people a sense of like cherishing their life, or even like the opposite, which I think might be more plausible, it gets one to feel that like death is not as important, right? Like devaluing death, right? There are people, like you mentioned, the like kind of like old timey, like our children are more violent because of video games type of, trope, right? Like we've all heard that kind of argument before. And it's something to take seriously, to some extent. Like, we should be trying to understand the effects that video games are having on people. But is it the case that, let's say some of like these like mass shooters that we've seen in the last like 20 years were desensitized due to death or whatever? Maybe not even take them. If that's, I don't want to polarize you. I don't want you to like, do you think that in regular to everyday people, who play video games perhaps devalue death or cherish it based on their play?
I think that the everyday person is not all too impacted by how death is utilized in games as a mechanic, meaning like, I have X number of lives. If I fall into a pit, then, you know, I say I died, or I see my character put 2 X's on his eyes, something like that. Like, I don't think that leans one way or the other.
What about action movies? What if it's like when it's more realistic, or like, you know, never before in human history, right? Like before, let's say 100 years ago, right? All of the time before that, the only death you would experience was death that you encountered, or perhaps in stories that were passed down, right? We're inundated with death now. Like almost every day I'm seeing death, you know, on any TV show or movie, you know, I'm going to have some kind of exposure. Certainly every week I face death in some kind of narrative form, you know, either reading it or seeing it or playing it. Do you think that like the frequency or ubiquity of death, you know, in other media, perhaps more realistic media, has an effect? Or do you think that we're basically kind of like we understand it's fake and it's not really getting deep into our consciousness?
Dang, I kind of think it's a little bit of both. Like, I do think that we acknowledge, you know, normal, healthy, whatever you want to describe it, human beings that look at a piece of fictional media or a piece of dramatized media and then say, oh, yes, I understand, like, this is fake violence, they're using makeup, whatever, blah, blah, blah. Like, but this is very compelling as a show. I think, you know, we acknowledge that and can operate with that. But also, yeah, seeing it happen, I think, so much and in so many different ways can, I don't know if desensitize is the right word, but it can make us unprepared for the moment where it does actually happen, either to us or to someone near us. I think the main point I'm trying to make there is like maybe like the gravity of death won't be as recognized. And this again is all based on, you know, the person's like understanding of the world and how life works and this, that, and the third, right? So like, let's take a 20-something that's grown up. They know what right and wrong is. They know how life and death works. They've been playing plenty of video games that have like killing enemy players as like part of the objective. I imagine if they are, you know, playing a ton of Call of Duty and then one of their friends gets like killed by gunfire, or potentially if they're at a shooting range and a horrible shooting range accident happens and they see their friend with a gunshot wound writhing on the ground, maybe somewhat similar to how some of these characters in games would writhe on the ground. I imagine even though that's a horrifyingly relatable moment happening between the game and real life, I think the fact that like that has been seen or experienced in a non-real way, simulated way, that might affect that like half a second of like cognitive thinking in the mind that is like, did this actually just happen? Am I believing what my eyes are showing me? Like, is this actually like super serious? And yeah, I think that's kind of like where I'm going to end that, because I don't want to read too much into it. I definitely think if you see a lot of this thing that you typically associate as like, yes, this is the magic circle. Like people are only going to get shot around me when I am playing Call of Duty, and I'm going to know that these people are always Call of Duty people. And then out of nowhere, you're in a very Call of Duty situation, but Call of Duty's not being played. I think that will create some sort of like surreal speed bump in the inner workings of your mind. I don't think that'll say like, oh, okay, well now you got to kill this guy, or now you got to like record this crime in progress. But I think it'll certainly be a cause for pause.
Yeah, that's interesting. So it's almost like there's just kind of like another layer to emotionally processing death. If you have a video game experience that, you know, in some way is resonant of an actual experience.
Yeah.
So I want to introduce a concept called panpsychism. Have you ever heard of this, Los?
No, I have not heard of panpsychism.
In order to get to panpsychism, right, I want to talk about how I conceive of you know, human consciousness. And I mentioned this before, you know, epiphenomenalism was, I think, a term I dropped a few episodes ago. Essentially, you know, thinking of consciousness and the mental properties that exist in the realm of consciousness, right, as actual things that are, you know, acknowledging them, validating them, consciousness exists, like mental entities are actual entities, right? But physical entities are the ones that have causal power, right? So I have a brain, I have neurons that are firing, and the firing of the neurons somehow creates consciousness, right? And it's hard to really understand exactly how that consciousness is kind of being sparked, right? When I look at a rock, I don't think a rock has consciousness, right? When I look at a plant, I might think that plants have consciousness, right? They have networks that, they seem to be affected by their environment, yada, yada, yada. Somehow, we recognize them as life, right? Panpsychism argues that a mental phenomenon, right, consciousness, exists not because of matter, but it is a part of matter and is actually in all things, right? Pan meaning all, right, or everything. So the reason that I wanted to talk about this with our death episode specifically is because our concept of death is linked to our concepts of personal identity, right? When I die, or if I know of my death, right, I will think of that as like, well, I'll no longer be able to write, I won't be able to listen to music, I won't eat any food, right? And I'm thinking about this being that I call me, right? But if we zoom out or zoom in and think of me as just a bunch of cells, or zoom in further and think of me as a bunch of atoms, right? If I don't think of those atoms as possessing mental properties themselves, then once I'm dead, once my heart stops beating, there is no identity that I can latch on to. But it could be the case, right? And Annika Harris is someone who, I wouldn't say defends panpsychism, but she gave a lot of attention to it in a book that she wrote. Her book is called Consciousness, A Brief Guide to the Fundamental Mystery of the Mind. And I was surprised at how much attention she gave to it, right? And she really tries to walk through this as a possibility. And it seems to me like this is something that would quickly be dismissed, right? We don't think of a rock as having mental phenomenon at all because it doesn't have a brain, right? Because it doesn't have some kind, like a neural networks that are firing, that are generating this kind of consciousness. And one of the problems that we have with panpsychism, right? Or one of the mysteries that remains is, at what point do I get the sense that I feel conscious, right? At what point does my personal identity, do I have enough, nodes of consciousness, right, or conscious properties that I now have a vast interior life, right? I have thoughts, I have feelings. At what point does that happen, right? Yeah, so I guess to just bring it back to the very, very base of the argument, right? All things have mind, right? All things have mental qualities, right? From sand to, a vase, right? All of those things, even if we don't think of them as thinking, right? They're not thinking things, but there's a fundamental mental quality that is in all things. So, what I was trying to say about the personal identity, perhaps that's where I got a little kind of off track or something, but when we think about death as the death of the identity that I identify as, right? It could be the case that all of the atoms that, comprise me are going to continue living, or not living, but having mental phenomena, right? There will be mental properties that are passed on. And, perhaps I will have maybe not full-blown consciousness the way that I think of it now, but other kinds of mental experiences, right? Whatever those may be. In the same way that we recognize that if I'm cremated or, if I'm buried, eventually my body will, transform and become other matter, right? It's not like the matter goes away completely. It's just transformed. And for a panpsychist, the mental properties are also transforming in a similar way, where there's some irreducible quality to the mind and to these mental properties. Certainly they won't, you need a human eye to see color, right? Or, so it's not like, it's not as, we have to really change how we think about mental properties because we're so used to thinking of them with the equipment that we have, right? But there are other metaphysical possibilities out there. And perhaps if someone does believe in the panpsychist doctrine, they can have a peace with death because even though their identity as they know it will eventually come to an end, it is possible that their mental properties will continue to exist, and that in some transformed way they will continue to exist as a mental being.
Damn. So that would that mean like someone who thinks this way, would the worms that eat them then be part of their consciousness moving forward? Or like would their I guess actually vice versa. Would their consciousness, like if I'm dead and like I'm not really thinking much because I'm dead, but then the worms eat me, does that mean now part of my consciousness are within the worms that ate me?
Yeah, I mean, I guess like the mental properties that are, you know, in a piece of matter, you know, or like, you know, in is a very, it's weird.
Like,
prepositions get odd here.
Will my love of a specific anime get somewhat tangentially rubbed onto a worm that kind of ate me? I know, like, it's a bad question because we can't ask the worm what it will like, but like, I'm getting like the most horrific image of Get Out, like from what you're telling me, and I'm hoping I'm just misinterpreting.
I do feel like that's reductive, and you know, we really have to change how we think about consciousness again, because it's not like a worm will ever have the capacity to even know what an anime is or understand language or anything like that, you know. But the idea that there is, you know, transfer, right, and mental properties are being transferred, it's at this point impossible to know exactly how consciousness arises or the extent to which it can exist in a being that isn't alive, right? There are questions about artificial intelligence, for example, where, you know, is there real such thing as machine learning? Can machines actually learn, right? That kind of presupposes these kinds of questions as well. But, you know, for a panpsychist, there's no reason why they couldn't. They're made of physical things which are already endowed with mental properties. So when it seems like your computer is thinking, perhaps it's not the same kind of cognition, but there may be a mental experience that is being had to some degree.
Okay.
It's not the same as being like animated, right? So I think like to some extent for a worm to be able to process like, oh, this anime is dope, you know, it would have to have like very sophisticated, you know, intelligence, not just it's not just mere experience. But I mean, even for us, the most basic experience we can have is like if I stand very close to a wall and I try to not think about anything and I just let that the raw sensation hit my eye, right? Like that is conscious. That's an experience I can be conscious of, right? I can have a meta awareness of the fact that I'm seeing something, right? But there is, if I turn all that off and I just let let's say the white wall hit my eyes, you know, there doesn't necessarily need to be any thinking or any feeling associated with that, but we would still say it's a conscious experience, right? And if we're talking about at a much less complex level than, you know, the human brain, there are going to be even more fundamental things that we can't really comprehend. And that's part of the reason why like panpsychism, I think, is perhaps not something you've ever heard of, you know, not something that a lot of people are taking seriously. I mean, how do you begin to research it? You know, like what do mental properties look like if we're searching for them? You know, I'm not going to be able to find that with a telescope. A microscope or a telescope either. There is no tool. Right. That's the point. It doesn't matter which tool I choose. But it also begs the question, you know, like what is a mental property? You know, what does it mean to have, you know, for something to have a mental property? And all of those are kind of, you know, I think the things about philosophy that a lot of people find detestable, perhaps. You know, it's like we can try to have the same conversation, but, you know, we're defining parts in ways that are immeasurable and abstract, you know, and there might, even if there's like logical soundness to the argument, if it's untestable, you know, then what are we going to do about that? Who cares if there are mental properties on some level if we can't detect that they're true, if we don't know that they're true? But, you know, I mean, this is kind of how religious belief comes about, right? Some people may hear about panpsychism and then like develop a faith associated with it, right? And believe that like we have a duty to all things, you know, the planet itself, because there is some kind of, you know, consciousness that we should all be, safeguarding, basically.
Yeah, it kind of vaguely reminds me of, was it like Jingoism? Jainism, yes, it reminds me of Jainism, where like people would, have to kindly brush ants away from the floor so that they don't accidentally step on them.
Yeah, those big palm leaves. No insect murder.
Seems just very, I don't know. I've been spoiled by convenience. Like I can't. Seems like the both the physical load and the mental load of being like everything has mental impact. Like I have mental impact is like too much to account for, or too much to be polite to.
Yeah, I mean, it's like are they freegans? Is that what they're called? Like people who will not like pick an apple off a tree. They'll wait till the apple falls because they have to have respect for the tree itself. And I mean, if we think about pain and pleasure as mental phenomena, right? And so perhaps those are the most fundamental, and like even plants can experience those even though they don't have the capacity to experience color or have feelings or whatever. Again, all of this is conjecture. I'm not actually making any claims about what the mental states of plants, insofar that those may exist. Thank you for listening to Deep in the D-Pad. Subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts and share us with your friends.
For updates and discussion, follow us on Reddit at r/deepinthedpad, Facebook at deepdpad, and subscribe to Deep in the D-Pad on YouTube. Don't forget to hit the bell.
And if you want to ask us questions or you had a chance to share your own D-Pad delight on the show, email us at askdeepinthedpad@gmail.com. Be sure to put question or delight in the subject line.
Big thanks to 8-Bit Jazz and Kevin MacLeod for supplying the music for the show.